Counter-formation of culture is part of the application of spiritual formation. This and much more will be discussed by Tyler and I, your hosts, today on Praxology, where theology fuels the mission of the church. It certainly meets the church as well. If you are newer to our show, we take issues and ideas by thinking biblically, reflecting theologically, and acting missionally. We'll certainly do all three of these things today, Tyler, in a topic that you have been looking forward to talking to.
I've been advocating for this topic for a while, so it's gonna be a fun one.
Before we just jump right in, though, a follow-up from our takeover interview.
Yes, wasn't that That turned out great, right?
Yeah.
We just got to kind of sit in the passenger seat and have some fun, answering some questions, talking about fun. Talking about creative solutions to spiritual formation in kids, and also applying our theological and biblical training to a real life kind of case study, which is always really, really valuable.
For sure. Yeah, and it was a lot of fun. Maybe we'll get somebody else who's like, hey, I liked that. I want to come on and I want to take over the podcast.
Yes.
And come interview us. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Also just appreciate always hearing from somebody who's deep in the ministry,
Absolutely.
Who's deep in their field and has a sense and a touch for what God is doing in that particular environment. So I hope that we'll bring on some others in the future who have that same kind of missional touch.
For sure. Yeah, and Claire, we can't speak enough within Josiah Venture how she does with kids. Her heartbeat is for exactly what we were talking about. How do I myself and how do I help other families pass on their faith to their children? And one of the things that's amazing within Josiah Venture is that there are so many kids who grow up who not only stay in the faith, which is actually quite phenomenal in and of itself if you know research related to pastors' kids and that kind of thing. Not only stay in ministry or grow up in faith, but stay in ministry or join ministry and do things maybe slightly different than what their parents were doing. But I mean, you guys are one of those people.
Yes.
Two of those people.
Yes.
You and your sister.
Me and my sister and my brother. We all came back to serve with Josiah Venture and continue participating in the movement of God in Central and Eastern Europe. And there are others like that as well. So it's not a must. Not everybody's called to go back to the environment in which they grew up. And so many Josiah Venture kids, like you said, they go on and do other, serve in other great ways in other places. But it's certainly very rewarding to see so many following Jesus into their adult lives.
Yeah. So once again, thank you. Special thank you to Claire. And we were talking with her after we filmed, and she said, I thought about asking this question. And then she asked me the question, and I was just like, why did you not say that through the microphone? And so I'm going to repeat that question for her. I said I'm going to write this down. So this is still Claire taking us over.
Oh yes,
even one episode later. The question: what's the point of teaching if they won't remember it?
Yeah.
In other words, in passing on faith to children, not just academic environment, but what's the point of teaching if kids aren't going to remember everything?
Yeah. And she was passing along this question because it's one that she receives as she leads the children's ministry in her church. This is a question she's heard before, is like, what's the point of all these, telling all these stories and doing all this teaching when they are not going to remember what I said or what the point was. And so it's definitely something that even you might even think about yourself. How many sermons do you remember as an adult, let alone from your childhood growing up in church? How many, Sean? Tell me.
33.5%.
Oh, okay. Going with the percentage. I thought 33.5 sermons, but
it's possible. Way more than making it way less than 33% is probably accurate. Yeah.
Yes. But I think it's a great question, and it betrays a little bit of the presuppositions that we have about how formation happens, which we're going to get into later today. It assumes that the point of the teaching is for you to acquire knowledge. So if children are not remembering the information, then obviously we must be failing. But that's just not the case, because teaching is about so much more than just imparting information. It actually is a formative experience. It's a formative event. And we actually take this approach in our college as well. When we have our classes, we actually ask our students to have already read some things before they come to class, so that the class can be kind of a workshop. I mean, we might summarize a little bit of the content, but we are actually drawing out the implications and kind of playing with it. That's almost more valuable than just imparting information, because it actually gives people the skills then to navigate their lives and navigate the world more critically, more thoughtfully. And so similarly with children, they might not remember everything, but the cumulative effect of kind of washing them with the Word of God and allowing them to see themselves within the drama of God's story is more than the sum of its parts. The whole is more significant than each individual lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm thinking in a slightly different way, but the same thing. Of why does it have to be? They have to remember every word or nothing. That's kind of how we talk about it. But really, we have to ask, what's the point of teaching? What's the point of passing something on? And it's to give somebody a framework so that they can then utilize it. In that sense, of course, they're not going to remember everything. Something is instilled in them, and then it becomes more about reminder at that point. Maybe we assume that kids don't actually remember as much as they do.
Maybe.
And rather, it's that core teaching, get that across, however, and then just simply do little remembrance or reminder types of things along the way. And then that provokes, oh yeah, within the framework or the structures of your own children's mind. And that actually always works better. In terms of learning, it's never data download. Sometimes that works. Some people claim that's the only way how I learn.
Yes.
But actually
rote memorization.
Yeah. It's quite proven that if you learn the same thing from within existing structures in your own mind and you give words to it first and you play with it, then you remember it longer than if somebody just simply said, hey, this is how it is, because that information came from outside of who you are and you have to integrate it in a different way than if you're doing it in the process of learning itself. Then the whole point becomes you don't have to learn and remember everything. It's more about practice and community and formation along the way that then helps to guide. I think also we tell our students that, and maybe it's quite shocking for some of them because I see their faces when I say it, and I'm like, you're never going to remember everything that you learned in this program. And some of them are like, well, of course.
Right.
Others are like, then why am I here?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's like when you go to the doctor. That little thing it's like a hammer. I call it a hammer. And they hit your knee with it. And what does your knee do? I'm doing it right now. I don't even know if anybody can see my leg here on YouTube watching. But they hit you with the hammer on your knee, and it just has this reaction. I mean, literally, that's why the phrase knee-jerk reaction exists. And it's involuntary. And so what you're learning and going through a theological program or the process of formation, discipleship, is
theological reflexes,
how to have the right reflex. And then over the course of time and more learning, you can diagnose more quickly, this is why I'm having that reflex, this is what I should do about it. And so it becomes less about learning everything and developing the right things and doing those well so that we can have the right reflex.
Sounds good to me. Makes sense.
No pushback whatsoever.
But you might have some pushback, and you can write to us at praxeology@formmission.org.uk and tell us all the ways in which we're wrong.
Or maybe right.
Or maybe right.
or nuance it however you wish.
Yes.
We love nuance on this podcast.
We do.
On to the topic for today. Respond to the opening statement, Tyler. Counterformation of culture is part of the application of spiritual formation.
Yes. The answer is B. No, just kidding. I think that's a really key element of spiritual formation, is that to be formed in one way is to not be formed in another way. To choose one path. Okay, let's think actually about Psalm 1, which is the opening of this book of Psalms, often called a wisdom psalm. It presents these two ways. One is, now I'm gonna misquote it, but blessed is the man who does not and then it lists some things. Does not walk in step with the wicked, stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. So that's one option. Okay, there's the one path. That's not the way of blessing, but that's an option. And the other way is, blessed is the one whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates on his law day and night. So there's a path, a very viable option of going down the path of the wicked, listening to the voices of others, versus going down the path of close attention to the voice of God. And part of formation, choosing the right path of listening to God's voice, is to not choose the other path, and actually to develop practices that help me stay on that path. So the one that's presented in Psalm 1 is to meditate on his law day and night. There's a rhythm that is instilled, a habit that is meant to guide in the counter formation, the not going down the path of folly, according to using the words of Proverbs.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, when we use the word meditate, I'm influenced. I think I've referenced this book many times recently on the podcast by Dornier, the Psychology of the Fruit of the Spirit, and it's got me wondering, but meditate. We tend to probably think that that's mostly a cognitive thing. But actually, we have to be in the right disposition, our entire bodies, so that we're in a right place to be able to meditate, to focus on the presence of God and maintain. That sounds weird, like maintain it, but stay in that posture.
Yeah.
And so even that is a type of communal. It has an interpersonal element to it. I suppose it's an overstatement to say it's communal unless people are meditating together. But
yep, no, I think you're totally right. This word, there's been a number of word studies done on this word, meditate, and some other ways that it could be translated might not be ultimately helpful, but just to give kind of a broader picture, the image of a cow chewing cud. That's a fully embodied action, essentially.
We don't have multiple stomachs.
We don't have multiple stomachs, but but we have lots of pockets where we can hide God's word into us.
well recovered.
And chew it, swallow it, then pull it up again, chew it some more, swallow it, pull it up and chew it some more. The image is actually an embodied one. Another possible way that we could look at this is actually mumbling. The meditation of mumbling is just saying these truths to ourselves about who God is and what He's done, kind of in kind of almost intangible words, but like letting them roll over us to ourselves. So again, that's not just rolling around in your head, but that's actually involving your whole body. So just some interesting ideas. But counterformation, there are lots of things in this world that are seeking to form us. Sometimes these are fine, these are not harmful. Sometimes they're not great for us, and sometimes they're actually very intentionally meant for our harm, or for the harm of our souls, if nothing else. So we need to be aware of those things and seek to be formed in ways that are helping us to draw nearer to God.
Yeah, and it makes me reminded of a book.
A book, do tell.
And I'll just frame it with a question, and then those familiar with this book will be like, "Oh, of course." How do we inhabit time? From what you're talking about, and in order to meditate and do these things well, we have to think about how we actually live now. How do we inhabit time? It comes from a book, James K. A. Smith. Surprise. We mentioned him.
What a guy.
Once more. He's fantastic in this topic.
How to inhabit time.
It's a wonderful, wonderful text. And there could be a joke there.
Oh, yeah?
How do you inhabit time?
How?
Exist. That's it.
Oh, okay.
You just be. It's an existential joke.
An existential joke.
But
wow.
In all seriousness, we can inhabit time well and utilize it for the kingdom through a contemplative life, through meditating, and amidst other things. A contemplative life and thinking about how in each moment we are living in time, in each thought and each action. in the opening of the book, Smith says, in part why he writes is because he's giving an invitation to an adventure we call time. It's a fascinating way to put it.
That is a fascinating way.
How do we embody time? How do we inhabit time?
And time is an adventure.
We need to remember fun.
Right, exactly. We often see time as constricting, like, oh, if only I had an extra hour in the day, then I could get more done. Or, oh, no, I don't have any time. I'm in a hurry. But he's saying, no, it's an adventure. Time is an adventure to step into. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so we lead a contemplative life on how we're being shaped and formed. And part of this leads to seeing how culture is negatively then forming us.
Yes.
So we can ask the question, how can we use spiritual formation practices to counter negative formation of cultures? We'll discuss this idea using a few concise examples is probably the wrong way to say it. But we'll use two, maybe three different areas of counter formation to dialogue with this idea. Tyler, take us into the first one.
Ooh, okay. Well, I think let's start by establishing kind of a framework that can help us think through different approaches to formation.
That's probably better.
Going back to where we started, Claire's question, well, if they don't remember everything I said, was it actually transformative? That is an approach that prioritizes your mind. Okay, prioritizes you as a thinking thing. That's
like
a phrase.
A brain on a stick.
A brain on a stick, yeah. A brain on a stick. So James K. Smith, in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, or Imagining the Kingdom, one of those, both of those maybe. He also wrote a shorter one called You Are What You Love. Mm-hmm. Says that this is a kind of a product of the Enlightenment, where we kind of were convinced that our real value is found in our ability to think. I think, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. Who said that?
Descartes.
There we go.
My knee-jerk reaction was, I second-guessed it. Descartes.
Descartes, great. So that's very much, okay, I think, therefore I am. My identity is, and my uniqueness is found in my ability to think. And so a lot of our formation...
He wouldn't think that.
He wouldn't.
The Cartesian, well, never mind.
But a lot of our kind of education or formation approaches very much kind of presuppose that hey, the way to get to your heart is through your brain. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I think as Christians, we believe that the point of any formation is that our inward transformation, the transformation of our heart. God gives us a new heart, but then that outflows, and then it allows our whole being to be transformed. But the way to the heart is through the brain. Okay, so that's one approach. What are some positives of that sort of approach, Sean?
Careful attention to detail.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one that if we learn anything, at least from, I don't know why I'm just thinking of the reformers here. Maybe I do. The subtle aftermath of what doing that type of theology has created in people who are like, yes, the Reformation's fantastic. It does tend to be a more cerebral type of faith. That's not ultimately fair by any stretch. Even, I can speak more definitively toward Calvin by my own personal study. Yeah. I think he can be misread and be like, everything he was just Bible, very
Absolutely.
Cerebral. And if you look at his entire vision for what Geneva was supposed to be, there are some not probably great aspects of that, but the entire vision does speak towards embodied living in that sense.
Yeah. So not ultimately bad, or not, and there's nothing with learning. Like, we like learning, Sean. We like thinking. Our brains are great. But does information always transform our hearts?
I suppose it's situation specific. There are times information passes through and we chew on it and affects our hearts, but it's not like, I heard the right words, like it became a magic formula, and then my heart was just warmed. There's a lot more integration of our bodies happening than just that. I wonder, I'm thinking even of how the mind and the body works. And cut me off if you want to keep going before moving forward, but the idea of, I don't want to use the word, our emotions and our will. There's a lot of background processing
Mm-hmm.
that goes on in our bodies related to our emotions. And it's not just, we have a mind and then we have emotions, and we shouldn't let our emotions rule over us, so our mind takes control, which is where you were just referencing that whole mind takeover thing.
Yeah.
There are some positives to that. But
Yep.
there's a lot of social psychological research and just psychology research done that actually shows that the seat of the self of being is actually the Hebraic
Mm-hmm.
Hebraic way of thinking in terms of how we see the Old Testament that chewing the cud. That's what the prophets do. That's what they
Oh yeah.
It's very Hebrew thinking. I had a professor who grew up in Hebrew, and his class in Israel. I'm sorry, his class reflected that culture.
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
very cyclical, and it's like, wow, this is another world.
I know which one
Oh.
who you're talking about.
Yeah. It's the world of the Old Testament,
Absolutely.
as we read it in the Bible, and it's a fascinating thing. It's you could see that as maybe just a mind exercise.
Mm-hmm.
But not ultimately. It's affecting everything else, and that's the point.
Mm-hmm.
To chew on it over and over and over to see what else it affects, and then flip it over to a different angle just because. I love doing that too.
For sure.
Mine tends to be more in my head, so to speak, than probably the right Hebrew way of doing it.
I'm all for whole body integration. Yeah.
And but then we have the emotions
Mm-hmm.
and the will and those kinds of things. And that's more like if we want to say the heart. I think. Did you mention the other? If it's the
Yeah, I haven't gotten down yet. But let's take the mind as an example then of one approach of counterformation is, one caricature of that approach of like going through the brain to get to the heart is, Sean, you are afraid of cats. Is this true?
maybe
No.
at one point in my
No,
life.
it's
Right
probably
now,
not
it's
true.
not true.
Okay, let's imagine that you're afraid of
Snakes. Go with
snakes. Okay, Sean, you're afraid of snakes. How do I change that fear that is actually like central to who you are? Oh, I just tell you, snakes are not dangerous. You need to know that. You just need to know that snakes are not dangerous. Do you feel better?
I'm trying to place myself as a child, and my daughter, she'd be like, okay.
Okay.
But like sort of like that makes me feel a little bit better, but not ultimately better.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not bad to communicate truth and information, but does that ultimately solve the problem of formation? Maybe not entirely. We know plenty of people who,
Right.
we can all imagine somebody who's knows a lot of information, but actually doesn't live it out, or it doesn't, isn't transformative. So okay. So for sure, one way is to teach, or to go through the head. Another approach is to go through the body, actually, and so that is a very much not as common nowadays, but in different circles. We learn all kinds of things through physical action. For example, one example in Czech school that I grew up in, and my kids are in. One of the important things that you do with your body that is transformative is that every day when the teacher walks in the room, you're sitting at your desk, you stand up to greet her. What does that do for you? That's not just a random act. It actually teaches you something about your position in relation to the teacher, and it is transformative. It actually changes the way that you relate to your teacher and actually to older people as well. Oh, when somebody older
Forms
walks in,
of respect. Yeah.
yeah, form of respect, exactly. So I stand up. That's what I do. That's who I am, and that's transformative. This was actually, so going through the body is what actually Christians have done for a long time, not in isolation, but they've seen the power of physical activity as a means of transformation. By the way, another discipline that really understands this is a lot of like modern psychology. It's a lot of the problems, not problems, a lot of solutions to mental health problems is actually to be active, and to go out for a run, develop habits. And so they understand that the way to enter transformation is through activity, through the body. But what I was going to say is that the church has recognized this for a long time, and that's why if you go to churches that are more traditional, there's a lot of standing up, a lot of sitting down, a lot of maybe kneeling, different physical activity, going up to the front for communion.
Similar prayers over and over.
And similar prayers over and over.
And others.
Exactly. And these are not just random, they're actually very thoughtful and have the potential to be transformative. They're not automatically just teaching you information will automatically transform you. It's not true. But we're
not computers. We don't download information as if it's like a data backup or something like that. That's just not how we work.
Right, yeah. Right. And so similarly, if we just do things, it doesn't necessarily transform us, but at least sets us on the right path, and it starts kind of creating space for us to actually know God and experience a transformation, much like the meditation, the regular habit, the full-bodied engagement with God's word. So James K. Smith talks about these sorts of this body entry point as essential to the transformation of the heart. He says that actually we're more motivated by what we love rather than what we believe, which is a pretty strong statement. We go after things that we love, not just the things that we know are right. Again, we can experience, think of temptation, I might know that something is wrong, but I still really want it. I still really want that candy. So in order to combat that, we need to develop habits that help refocus our hearts and point them in the right direction. Similarly, Dru Johnson has written a book, and I can't see it. Hold on.
As you're looking for that, I've run across, actually quite some time ago now, but I just looked the text up so that I would remember it. It's called Minding the Heart. Ooh. The Way of Spiritual Transformation. It's quite a good book on the heart, more biblical, theological perspective from Robert Saucy. I don't recommend Saucy for a lot of things theologically, especially eschatology related. But minding the heart, we get that idea. Mind, heart. He's looking at that connection that you're moving towards talking about from Johnson. Yeah.
Feel free to continue to interject. Yeah, bring stuff in. So Dru Johnson wrote a very short book called Human Rights, The Power of Rituals, Habits, and Sacraments. And this is actually a very, very shortened version from his much more expansive tome, which is called, let's see if I can remember it, it's called Knowledge Through Ritual or something like that. And he argues that actually the things, it's our rituals and our habits are a main way of teaching us truth. Take, for example, the habit of brushing your teeth. Sean, how often do you brush your teeth?
Twice a day.
Oh, good for you. Who told you to brush your teeth twice a day?
Probably my parents.
And
I don't know.
Was it their idea? No, it was like, we are Smiths. We brush our teeth twice a day.
No, it was more like passed on from generation to generation.
Oh, there you go. Passed on from generation.
Where's the infinite chain of regress?
Right.
Like how far back can we go?
Well, it probably,
I don't know.
Probably went back to some dentist, right? Who maybe told your grandparents or maybe told your parents, your teeth are really important. And, there's this stuff called plaque that grows on your teeth. Mm-hmm. And in order to be a healthy human being and combat this plaque, in order for you to have healthy teeth, you need to brush your teeth twice a day.
That's probably true. Yeah.
So
and also, teeth, if they're not well, it affects other parts of our bodies.
There you
strangely enough.
So
it is
totally true.
Yeah.
So by giving you a ritual of brushing your teeth twice a day, that's actually instilling certain values in you, or teaching you certain truths about who you are, about your body. My body is fragile. I can't just let it deteriorate. I need to care for it, and actually I need to combat this plaque, and because it's bad, so I need to make sure I brush it off and buy some fancy toothpaste and only use
the spiritual formation practice of plaque wars.
Plaque wars, exactly. So you've been given a ritual to teach you certain things and actually help you become a certain type of person, and so it's kind of a silly example, but Johnson deals with some more significant examples as well. Any thoughts so far on this idea of knowing things and being formed through habits and ritual?
I'm reminded of several texts that come into my mind. One is Lave and Wagner. The book is called Situated Learning, and it talks about learning as ultimately not a construct, but it's informed by the community that we place ourselves in, and it basically is arguing for more critical thinking in a very, very basic sense. But that gets into it that the learning process itself is actually inherently social because God created us to be social beings. That's not, I'm adding that on their behalf. They did not. But it's more than just the knowledge. It comes into my head and somehow it's worked out. It's actually situated through our social surroundings, through others, through those who teach us and so forth. And it really is trying to move to connect that. It's not just learn nugget of truth, instilled in heart, become better person.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very regimented thought process that ultimately is not the most helpful. And there's a lot of research done that I was saying earlier before I stopped myself because I realized that I was jumping ahead of where you were probably going, of the role of emotions, that the role that emotions play in decision making.
Right.
It's actually quite incredible.
Yeah.
It's not as easy as, well, we make up our minds. Well, there's a lot of processes going on in the background of our body that are connected to the will, to the emotions, and all those processes. So they're really more integrated and connected than we think.
They need to be taken seriously, not just we're not saying like, oh, you need to bracket out the emotions. No, you need to actually take them seriously because they're incredibly powerful, motivating pieces in making decisions and living life. So
yeah, and I think one of the things it does is it puts some flesh to what Johnson is saying, and we can use some science, psychology things and say, yeah, the early church did some things that we thought, oh, that's just rudimentary. That's how things happened or whatever. Yeah. But actually, it's probably the best form of learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's give some concrete examples of maybe the ways that we are formed in this sense negatively, because lots of people know this actually about us, that the way to get to our hearts is actually to get us in some cycles and some habits. Think about your phone. How many of us open our phone first thing in the morning? Who told us to do that?
Steve Jobs.
Well, obviously it was Steve Jobs. No, what's funny is that, a lot of those Steve is no longer with us, but a lot of the people who are like really, really high in the tech world, they actually are super aware of the negative formative power of technology, that they severely limit it with their children because they know how what it actually does to a person. But we've been conditioned to, for example, when your phone, okay, maybe some of you saw earlier on the camera, my phone was buzzing and I was like struggling to turn it off, but I was getting so distracted. Okay. That's another, like, we've been trained. The buzz happens and immediately our attention has to go to it.
Let's take it a step further.
Okay.
How many of us, raise your hand if anybody's watching, they'll think you're strange. Maybe don't. But if you're by yourself, raise your hand. It's a good embodied exercise
there you go.
For this question. How many of us have felt our phones vibrate, but it was actually phantom vibration? It never actually happened. There's no indication on our phone of why it happened, but we felt it because it's like our brain has triggered some response. So like, need to check this thing.
Absolutely.
It's crazy. It even affects our like psychobiology.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. So that it's crazy. And so this is why I try as much as possible to turn off as many notifications on my phone as possible, because it just is incredibly disruptive. But it also it has an impact on you as a whole person, that when you're just constantly at the beck and call of every buzz, every ding. But that actually is a conditioned response that was conditioned through repetition and through ritual, and it teaches us to desire this.
Which is beyond just our mind, but our mind is involved.
Absolutely, yeah. So our mind is involved, but it's actually an issue of the heart that, oh, I need this, or maybe I want this even. I want to check Instagram. I want to feel important. I want to feel validated. And that's how the big tech companies make their money, because and not to be called conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of research that backs that up, that actually keeping your attention is the most valuable commodity in the world. So if they can capture it, and if they can capture so that you actually want it, if you actually want their product, then they've succeeded. So
yeah. So if we pause, we look at the formation principle in the world.
Yep.
It is that the things are done to tap into not only your mind but also your will, which is where the desires and the emotions are. And the world recognizes both of these things are connected, and they do certain things advertising wise and whatnot that reach the seat of our being. So in order to counter form via spiritual formation,
yes,
I mean, there's an easy leap to all things liturgical, but can you provide for us something that's very specific, like a practice that actually counters the formation of what's happening with our phones?
Right. Yeah. So if we're being as concrete as possible, yeah. So the question is then, what's that doing to us? What it's making us anxious people. Actually, it's making us less aware, less present. Even like if I'm talking to you and my phone's buzzing, then I'm not being fully engaged. So I need to develop practices that can help me be more present and more aware. And I mean, I like my phone. I like being able to work on stuff remotely. So that's not the issue, but the issue is what is it doing to us? So if I want to become a less anxious person, the right response is not for you to tell me, Tyler, just be less anxious. Like don't be so stressed. Like, what are you doing? Like you're just stressed all the time. Just stop it. That's one way, going through the brain, perhaps, or like maybe by brute force on the will. But another option would be say, okay, what counter formative rituals do we need to instill? Maybe that means actually stopping the ritual of your buzzing telephone. And so you turn off all notifications. It might mean we have a former student who turned his phone to black and white so that it would be less stimulating as well, and wouldn't, would just...
Or my wife sets time limits on her phone.
You set timers, exactly. So those are some really concrete things. But beyond just setting time limits or limits on this counter-formative ritual, which is not a bad thing, we also need to think about positive rituals that actually do what we want them to do. So how do you be less anxious? How do you be more present? That's then a really fun thought. And it doesn't have to get crazy liturgical. It could be that every morning I make breakfast before I check my phone. You know, I start my day by being fully present and engaged and check in with my family before I turn my attention elsewhere.
So distracted and anxious, or starting off engaged.
Yeah.
Essentially. Carry on.
Yeah. So that's a very simple way where you think what's another counter ritual or counter formative habit that I can instill that I can actually do what I want it to do. Another thing that some people have, even non-Christians, have found value in is actually taking a techno Sabbath, where you actually turn off all electronics, all screens on your Sabbath, on Saturday or any other day that you're resting. Again, in order to cultivate more of a habit of presence and less anxiety, more satisfaction. So those are just a couple of very easy that are non-threatening, I think, to probably most of our listeners. But then there are also some great spiritual counterformative practices that we could also talk about. But those, yeah.
Let's keep here for a second, because you're anticipating, I think, a question in my head of these counter formation principles are good to counter the formation that we don't want, that our culture says we need.
Right.
But there's more that could be said, perhaps, in terms of how those things become maybe spiritually formative practices. But then if we use that language, then maybe the question really is, are we broadening out that category too much to where it becomes so elastic it's no longer helpful? I don't know. But I'm also I'm wondering that could be true. But I'm also wondering that, oh goodness, there are 5 specific things that Simeon Zoll, professor at Cambridge, references that the Spirit uses to cause growth in us as believers, and it's things like personal history,
Yes.
and really in-depth levels. Forgive me for not remembering the others, but with that into play, it could make sense that small little changes like that in a bigger picture actually are producing those effects. Maybe we call some specifically spiritual practices and some just counter practices. Maybe we can further debate that. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful for us to kind of go back to some of the earlier discussions we had at the beginning of the season about like spiritual formation and what actually makes spiritual formation spiritual. It's not just about becoming a better version of me, or in terms of the counter formation that happens where outside influences are trying to form us. They're trying to form us into a different image or instill other values that might not be true to what we want. We need to be formed spiritually, which means in cooperation with the Holy Spirit to become more like Christ. And so that's the aim as we think about countering the negative formation. We need to think like, what can we engage in that will actually produce what we want, which is Christ-like character, which is the fruit of the Spirit, which is more intimacy with the Father.
Yeah, and I meet with somebody fairly frequently here in Czech who has an alarm that goes off on their phone every day at the same time as a reminder to pray.
Yeah.
That's, as we're talking, I'm like, wow, that actually is a counter-formative principle to using my phone in a better way than just being addicted to it and checking it all the time. And it also is using it as a platform for being more spiritually engaged. It's quite a remarkable overall connection that's happening there. Maybe there's something to that.
Yeah.
Spiritually formative practices of setting alarms on our phone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's much more that could be said, and I think that we'll talk some more about some even historic Christian practices of counterformation in future episodes. This was another really important historical theological study that was one of the best books I read last year, called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. Basically argues that the way that Christians had the impact that they did in society in the first 3 centuries before the explosion of Christianity was by virtue of their deep formation. They didn't just know, they didn't just they did know, they actually knew more deeply by virtue of the practices that they engaged in, and there was a value of developing certain Christ-like character, certain virtues through what they called habitus, which is actually which is like the reflex that we talked about earlier. It's the theological reflex that just comes out of you naturally, but because it comes as naturally because it's been intentionally formed in community. So I think we'll talk more about that. But just to say that's, he argues in his book that's actually what made all the difference, is that then the outside world looked at this crazy band of Jesus followers and said, wow, something is really different about you. You actually live differently in the midst of a world that is exerting a lot of other influences on you. So I think we have that same opportunity today. We don't live in a world that is majority Christian, especially out here in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And we have a great opportunity to show people what living with Jesus really looks like. But we need to be thoughtful about how we're developing that character by what we teach, for sure, but also by the habits that we embody.
Which gets to spiritual formation and discipleship, not just of children.
Yes.
But as a whole. We talked about adults in that episode with Claire as well. And I'm thinking of the Psalms of Ascent.
Oh, yes.
I can't remember the references of where those are. 120?
It's like 124 to something. Either it's
120,
a whole series.
135 or something.
I can find it.
15 or so. But nonetheless, the Psalms of Ascent could become an interesting example of this, perhaps, of involving fun, various practices, the people of Israel together going up to worship.
Yes.
Preparing their hearts, but they're doing a lot of other things. They're singing. They're singing songs together, and those things are meant to counter the other ways they've been formed from the cultures around them who are broadly speaking just pagan. And so they're countering those things very actively. And one thing that's interesting that maybe we can figure out, how do we recover that? And it's getting to the realm of desire. If we've learned something, is that formation in the world gets to the realm of desire, the deep part of who we are. In Christian formation, do we have a tendency to stay only in the head realm? Because if we get too much into the embodied practices, then we become moralistic or something. Whereas I don't think it has to go that route whatsoever. We need to figure out that maybe the challenge in thinking about formation, counterformation, spiritual formative principles. How do we reach the seat of the heart?
Right, and that's what we're after. We want inner transformation. So and that is fully embodied as well. So yeah, the Psalms of Ascent is Psalms 120 through 134. So if anyone's curious, it's one of the really it's one of the only, I think, collections that is grouped together in the Psalms. There are other similar types of Psalms that are smattered throughout, but this is like a whole collection of Psalms that were used for the journey up to Jerusalem. And
those again were holistic.
Yes, very much so.
And they were meant to challenge a lot of things. So in next episode, I think we've given hopefully you an appetite, those following along with us and watching along with us as well, for how does this work in trying to get into the details of life instead of just staying at a high level and talking about formation. So as we wrap up for today, I'll say the next episode will further look at counterformation principles. And we did tend more general, moving towards specific today, probably. Next time, we're going to workshop.
Oh, yeah.
This will be great. We're going to workshop one question. It's not, it could be something similar to, what are students being formed by, and what does the church need to do to counter that formation? This will be Tyler and I workshopping the question as concretely as possible, and it'll be live without prepared notes or much forethought, so that you can get the structures of how we might actually think and go about this type of situation.
And we do these kinds of discussions outside of the microphones quite a bit, so you'll get an insight into our fun little brainstorming. What's it called? Interchange.
Dialogue,
sure.
Oh, and you're doing your PhD with dialogue matters.
Yes,
it becomes the first thing that's easy to forget because you're in it so much.
Right.
Yes. So we hope that this will give you a taste of the structures again of how we think and how we would go about actually thinking about an answer, moving from the theological to the practical. Those two things should not be separate.
Nope.
And that's why we want to think biblically and reflect theologically towards that. So we'll discuss being in the world, but not of it, and essentially what this means for spiritual practice.
Yeah.
Until next time, we say go in the peace of our Lord Jesus Christ, in the power of the Spirit, and in the grace of God. Blessings.
Blessings.